Peace, y'all. It is I, the Energy Master, the Emma. I'm back at you. Okay, so if you haven't seen part 1 of this Decoding the Matrix Workshop part 7, so 7.1, if you haven't watched that one, go back and watch that one first so you kind of caught up. If you haven't watched the first 6 workshops, so you can get that background, get caught up. If you haven't also subscribed to the YouTube channel, do that right there. And make sure you check out those AI deep dives where we let modern technology discuss some of these issues that and give us some perspective on some of these things and these explorations into who we are, how do we operate, the secrets of the world. Okay, so without further ado, we're gonna jump right into this whiteboard. So if you remember from the end of part 6, we were talking about this line of code that was the 16th line in this meandering golden ratio sequence that we were looking at, and discovered that these first few numbers spelled Enki, like the Sumerian god from the mythology, but it spelled it in a very interesting way, Enhki, and we explored what was going on with that. And so, what am I proposing that this code is? I'll get into a little bit more about how magnetic fields appear to store memory using a sort of circulation that is very much tied to the vortexes and vortex math and all of that good stuff. But right now we're talking about the various words that show up inside of this particular sequence. And in part 1 of this workshop 7, we were talking about the Jesus problem, how there's so many different stories of Jesus, and that there appears to be one narrative, one source code, if you will, from which several iterations of that story are being manifested from, such that a particular field deficit, if you will, for the collective consciousness and magnetic field of the planet manifests souls or attracts souls or assembles souls based on a particular need for the planet at that time. And that's kind of what we're getting at with all of this child motif, if you will. All right, so we're going to go back over here. So in workshop 6, we ended on that notion of this idea of the first couple letters, so that 5, 14, 8 back here, giving us this word, this Ankh, which we using our understanding of the phonetics, such that H is that het noise, so Ankh, not just N, so Ankh. So that gives us peace. So it's a Mongolian word for peace, and of course Islam is derived from salam, which is peace. And we'll get into a little bit more. You see, I have it broken down with the pyramids, the acronym, and so we'll get into that in a second. I've done it before, but I'll do it again. But let's move on to the key. So you got, instead of it just being Enki as one word, we're looking at it as 2 words. Enhki, which is earth in Sumerian, but it is also the Japanese equivalent for chi, like in China, which is life force. And this is associated with a couple other things that I'll get into. But then your vital body, your life force body, we call that the pranamaya kosha. Prana is the word for chi in India, and the pranamaya kosha is also known as the breath body, because your breath isn't just air, but it is a whole network of circulation and charges and things of that nature that connects you to the atmosphere of the planet. So in a conversation of how your body communicates with the environment and with the earth, respiration is a very important aspect of that. And so if we put those two together, we've got a combination of peace on earth, Enhki. That's two separate words. But then we also have this idea of Islam. They say Islam is a natural way of life, not a religion, is what they teach in the 5%. And their acronym is I, Self, Lord, Am Master, or I, Self, Lord, and Master. We broke it down in the previous video, in the part 6 video, so you can go back and look at that to see the connection between that and Jesus, this uniting of the Ish, the Isha, and the Lam, so the freezing of fire, if you will. So it's an order. It's taking that wild thing, that wild fire, that wild will, and applying mathematics to it, because Islam is mathematics according to our supreme alphabet. And when you apply mathematics, that vortex mathematics we were just talking about, to flame, this is the equivalent of applying magnetic containment fusion to plasmas, because fire is a plasma. So Lam means flame, or teach or learn in Hebrew. And then Ish, so Ish means ice in Nordic runes, but it's also you can look at that as solidification, so the spirit coming into solid form. And Isha in West African traditions, you got an Isha people in West Africa, but you also got the term Isha, which basically means always active. And in activity, action has to do with karma. So in other words, it is eternal karma. So there's various levels of karma. There's like the karma that has to do with your immediate actions and choices that you make right now. But then there's different types of karma, which is basically actions and memory that is necessary for you to have a physical existence. There's higher versions of karma that manage universal aspects of things of that nature. And so we are talking about those in this case that you're learning to work with that karma. And apparently this line is suggesting that it has to do with you dealing with the karma associated with your life force, and earth being your nature, so your inherent nature. So that means we're talking about really the soul, so the template of the soul, and being able to tap into that in order to inform how you physically manifest it. Okay, so the last part of that is this 01980 cipher. 198 cipher. So that gives us Osho. So depending on where you're from, you might know the word Osho from. In Japanese, Osho is the name of a high-ranking Buddhist master. So that's already kind of interesting in and of itself. If you were around in the 70s and so forth in America, you probably remember a spiritual leader who what was his name, Rajneesh or whatever his name was, and he changed his name to Osho. There's a very interesting Netflix documentary about him, a mini series about him. So if you want to, you can check that out if you want to. It's not necessarily for what I got going on here today, but interesting nonetheless. And then finally, last but definitely not least, we want to talk about Osho as it means in Yoruba language, which is a sorcerer or a wizard. Okay, and I got the breakdown there. So the etymology of the word wizard is actually wise man. So that already gives you some hints at the three wise men associated with the birth of Jesus. And then the three wise men are also associated with the three belt stars of Orion, the constellation. And so these are motifs that pop up in a number of places and start to give us hints as it relates to this Jesus problem that we're having, with all different converging stories, and then just kind of looking at what these fields, what these numbers are saying about all that. And so, wise man is basically the meaning of Homo sapien. So, your species as a human is Homo sapien. Homo is man. Sapien means wise or wisdom. Sapience is wisdom. Okay, and I kind of like uh how the Wu Sabat folks, how they relate to the Sabaeans, because if you look at some of my videos, like the phonetic clues and the things that are popping up in numbers, they do kind of lead to the Sabaeans, because Saba, Queen of Sheba, she they also wrote that as Shabes. So the Nawapians have a pretty interesting breakdown of how the tribe of Shabazz, as Nation of Islam teaches it. There may be two overlapping concepts that are confused with each other, whereas you have Shabazar associated with the black people of India with the straighter hair, and then you've got the Sabaeans, which are associated with the Ethiopians and the more curly hair, descended from the what they call them, the Panajaru, or the did I say that right? Panajaru, or whatever they call them. But case in point is we've got an overlapping heritage, and then one of the key things that we're distinguishing for the purposes of what I'm teaching is the fact that as an American black person, we're pretty much a blend of all the different kinds of black people on the earth. Like there's various processes they go in. So we could either sit here and fight over semantics about who is who, or we could acknowledge the fact that we are the result of all the different stories, all the different mixes, all the different origins, all the different genesis. And that's for the sole purpose of us being able to work out the collective karma. Remember, we had that word karma a minute ago with that action, and we get to work that out. Okay, so boom. So Osho is also the name of one of the Orisha in Yoruba tradition, and he is a god of farming and fertility. Okay, so you had a lot of fertility gods and things of that nature. Similarly, you saw we had Ki, that earth pop up right there, and Geb, the earth god from Egyptian pantheon. Peace, Heidi, I see you. From the Egyptian pantheon, he was also involved with fertility and farming and things of that nature as well. So it's interesting that these two things would pop up. So we have a lot of different gods and myths that become syncretized over time. So in other words, as new cultures pop up, they'll come up with their own set of gods and deities and spirits and stuff like that, but they're based on the same principles as the previous culture. So it's just a information storage type of system, but because these stories are so embedded in the cultures and so on and so forth, the likelihood of having beings or individuals who embody some of the characteristics found in these stories is very possible from generation to generation. So you can look at it that way. With each culture, each generation has their own Jesus for the most part. So it has nothing to do with just this concept of one particular man, and then the one that was born around 1 BC or 1 AD or whatever at the beginning of this this calendar, this section of the Roman calendar, may not be the one you think, even though the one that you think about mostly, because it's basically three stories, like at least according to the breakdown I heard earlier, combined with other things that I was already aware of, that it's definitely three key stories that are combined into the streamlined narrative we normally look at with the way they've compiled the Bible nowadays. That's not how it was originally arranged, because a lot of those books were separate from each other, but when they collected them together, we get a particular narrative with the Gospels. All right, so we got that covered. So Enki, it could be peace on earth, or we could do a mathematics of your life force. And then we have this wizard. So this wizard, this sorcerer, is someone who was able to bring order to that life force, and we'll get into that as well with a magus. So we talked a little bit about the magus and magnets and how that etymology has to do with these O5 people, these quote unquote snakes. Well, that's what an Iesu is. So I was talking about Iesu on the first part of this, and you had, so in the story, at least the way that the Terror Papers talks about it, Enki, he and his brother were at odds. Enki was pretty much given dominion over the experiments and breeding programs and stuff like that on the earth in the Sumerian mythology, and his brother Enlil was given authority to reign over the planet from the heavens by his father. And so Enki is the one that is said to have given his creations, the people he made, some of his blood, and to give them a leg up so they would be able to fight. And so his disciples, the people that he taught, were called Iesu. They were initiates. And so the figure that we associate with Jesus was just one among these initiates who had a very special destiny, a predetermined destiny from basically a faction that was trying to fight back against the one in power, against Enlil, and then behind Enlil he was taken over by Enki's son Marduk, and then Marduk was up to some mess himself. So there was all these internal battles and stuff going on as far as that story goes. And so according to the Nuwapians, they say that you had, really you mixed with everything, but then as far as the Anunnaki goes, you had an already, just like everybody else says, an already evolving original black race on here, and then you had the Enki and his people who had also had associations with the Pleiadians. So that's where your idea of the bird motif, the eagle motif, the hawk motif, all that stuff comes into play. And that interaction, I propose, given that we do have a gene that we share with birds, that is basically the same gene that causes a bird to have feathers instead of scales, like a serpent or a fish. That same gene is what allows us as black people to have curly hair, coiled hair, as a selective feature of people of African descent. Okay, so as you notice, other populations do not have that same kinky hair. They may have different types of waves and curl texture because of different mixing along the way, but for the most part, we the only ones that have that good old nappy, and that's where that comes from, apparently. All right, and once again, you don't have to agree with anything. I'm just letting you know what the myths, what the stories, what the people are putting together. Okay, so wise man, Homo sapien, we got the sorcerer. And before I get into that breakdown some more, let's talk about one of these candidates for Jesus. So apparently, in the breakdown I watched with the Wusabat, they were talking about how you have the Jesus we're used to, the original Jesus, who was the son of Mary, who, you got the virgin story, and they go into a little bit more detail about the involvement of folks from Orion. So we talked about 3 wise men from Orion. Okay, and then that is what it is as well. But most importantly, you have him whose father. Okay, so we have Joseph as the stepfather, quote unquote, and then the idea is that God is the one that basically impregnates Mary. Well, the angels are considered aspects of God, which is why each of their names end in the name El, so El. So Gabriel would be, or Ibriel, or Gibriel. There's a couple, depending on what language you're in. It is a particular aspect of God, of El, that is known as Ibri, and so that's the same That's a root that is associated with Hebrew. It's associated with Nibiru, so Ibiru. It's in there. And it means basically to pass through or pass over, something like this. And so we're basically talking about penetration. So we've got certain words that we've covered. It means to cut or penetrate, to enter, to separate, to penetrate. And in this case, the penetration is happening to Mary. And so, and so the way they tell it, they say it may have been an artificial insemination situation, and they talk about Gabriel being with angels in general. We've talked about this concept of Enhki, and this is related to Enki. So and I'll get into that in a minute. But these Enki, who are a avian race, I guess you could say, so they're kind of humanoid, but then they actually have like a bird-like DNA, and so the idea, they say, is that that is what was given. So this same story about Mary and then and Jesus and this these angels or whatever that are involved, it closely parallels this other story about Enki saying that he used DNA from a bird type race in order to give those particular beings, those particular humans, the gift of the feather, quote unquote. And so you see some convergence in those stories. Whether they're true or not, who knows? But what I'm saying is there is convergence from stories from sources that are very far removed from each other. And it's interesting that they're saying some of the same things like that. Okay, but then so you had that Jesus. Then you had apparently, so you've heard stories regarding that Jesus had children, and that the Jesus we associate with the crucifixion is a different person. So we got the immaculate birth. We've got a child that also was known as Jesus. So he was Bar Jesus, or Simon Bar Jesus. And the thing, well, okay, so I told you about the initiate. So apparently in the Terra papers, they say so Enki, because he was considered the enemy, as far as Enlil was concerned, and Enlil had control of the churches and things of that nature. Enki and his initiates were depicted as serpents, as snakes. Even though there is serpent DNA associated with all of that, there are multiple reptilian races, not all just the evil ones that you hear the stories about, but just ones minding their own business that just happen to have, interactions here and there. And because our souls are made up of everything, we have everybody, so nothing excluded, not even them. Okay, and so anyway, so Enki and his disciples, they were the initiates. They had to kind of hide out. So when you hear stories like, for instance, the Essenes, the early Christians who were being persecuted by the Romans and stuff, it ties into that according to what they say. All right, and so the son, he was the one that was called a sorcerer because he was able to perform similar miracles to Jesus. And so he was ultimately blinded by Paul and them, and I think they took him out, I believe, and then buried him in Rome. And then the third iteration is one named Cleopis, who is, so the Nuwapians say he's the son of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But then what I found is there's a corresponding Cleopis who is actually I think that would make him the grandson of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, because her daughter's name was also Cleopatra of Selene. And she had a daughter named Cleopatra of Selene who had a consort named Simon, whose name matches that Simon Bar Jesus. So it's, for all I know, it's very possible that could be him. So that could be the son of Jesus right there, and then married the daughter of Cleopatra, and so they had this son Cleopis, who is said to have been married to a Sarah. I forget the other name that came up, but then it's just interesting that there is an alignment and an association even with Saint Sarah that the Romani, the Gypsies, they revere, and then the story seemed to connect her to the children of Jesus as well. So it's fascinating that all of them got that same story going on. Peace. I see my man's in here, Killer Cali. Peace, peace, peace. And so you got this overlap of these stories, and then you do have some historical information that kind of aligns. But then the Wapians, they got their version with some of the other things I'm talking about. Nation of Islam and other folks, they have their versions. And so all I'm doing is looking at these numbers, seeing which way they're pointing, and what seems to be the case is that it's pointing toward this Yoruba sorcerer, so that's West Africa. And then, mind you, Simon or Simeon was said to also be alternatively Niger, so Niger River, Nigeria, all of that. So that really that makes a very good case for Simon or Simeon in that case. And then when you think about ape or Simeon, they call those Simeon. So that it's fascinating that all those things kind of align. All right, so we were talking about the wise man. So in the Supreme Mathematics, of course, the number 7 is Allah God, and one of the parts of it we distinguished in the previous videos was that God is referred to as the wise man's equality. This is to build or destroy. So the wise man's equality. So it is equal to Homo sapiens. So it's basically saying man and God are one. In India, they say Jiva is Shiva, and what that means is that your soul, your eternal soul, is an aspect of God himself. It's just that your physical self is a projection. It is the beast that you are here to tame. So you are able to bring your godly aspect into this physical existence, not just want to die and just go over there. Peace, promise, I see you. But your job is to make this mortal flesh of yours more synchronized with the spiritual aspect of yourself, the eternal aspect of yourself through that soul. And that requires you to be able to translate that spiritual information, those impressions, in a way to where you can apply them physically to your body. So there are inherent limitations here on this planet, but then you've seen people that have been through practices and done things and trainings that allow them to exceed the normal limits of what's supposed to be possible for a person. So we keep on raising the bar in that way. So this is what meant here. Now, that God is wise man's equality, we made the distinction that wisdom is 2 in Supreme Mathematics, and equality is 6. So we're talking about 26 was that letter Z, zigzag zig, which is knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Knowledge and understanding are alike. That means father and child. And then zag is unalike. Okay. And so and then that digital root comes out to build or destroy. So when they say the wise man's equality, this is to build or destroy. They're giving you that relationship between 26 and 8. Okay, zigzag zig and he without the knowledge of self can neither build nor destroy, but takes away many lives. We break down build or destroy that number 8 into 2 4s because there's 2 ways you can go, build or destroy. And so 4 is culture. All right, that's your way of life. So you can have that way of life that adds on to life, which is to build. You can have that way of life that is to take away from life, which is to destroy. And the number 4, it tells you that I, God, I, self, Lord, and Master is the culture of freedom. So that's basically saying that if you understand what is meant by you and God are one and the same, it doesn't mean that you just do whatever you want or you rule over somebody else. What it's saying is that your soul is a reflection of your perfection, and that your physical self is just trying to do the best projection of that as possible into physical reality. And so the more in tune you are with that perfect soul, the more of those aspects come through, and then you have those figures like your Jesuses and whatever else in the story. Okay, so I, God, I, self, Lord, and Master. That's a breakdown of Islam right there. So this is your peace. So you get your peace from knowing, okay, I am in control of my destiny. I am in control of that which is within my domain. I'm not in control of somebody else. my universe exists within me, and as long as I manage that properly or whatever else, I am unfazed by what happens around me. If I'm happy inside, I tend to radiate happiness, and I become more pleasant to be around. I have a tendency to help more people, not because I'm trying to force myself to do it, but because I've taken care of what's going on inside of me. I've taken care and tamed that beast. I've tamed that reptile inside of me, and then taught it how to be civilized. I don't need to go over to somebody else's culture and try to enslave them and try to quote unquote civilize them. Because if you teach people, if you give people the knowledge of themselves, they will civilize themselves. All right. So this brings me to the Sumerian concept of Amaji. All right. So this means freedom in Sumerian, and is represented by this long symbol. So both of those. So it's Amaji, Ama and G. Okay, and it basically has to do with manumission. So in other words, they would declare you a free person. So if you were enslaved, Amaji literally meant to send back to your mother, and then the mother was Africa, of course. And so Amaji is also looked at as the potential source of the Berber group from Libya, the North Africans, called the Amaji, and then they say that it means free or noble man. So that's very much the same idea as this right here. But in addition, we get this transformation of the G and the Z, which is important. And so we look at this phonetic breakdown. So in Egyptian, the J sound is that D with that line under it, that diacritic. And we've talked about that. And so that sound is pretty much represented by DJ. So J, like in the caterpillar. That next one is a Z kind of figure, but it's that just sound, which can also be represented as a JH or a G. G is itself pretty interesting too, because in a lot of languages it transforms into a K sound. So whereas like up here where we have key or whatever, Gi could in some cases be key. The other place I wanted to point out with this life force body, this idea of a like the angel and Mary and the Enki and the this bird race, these Ankiel or what's another? It's another word, Aka, something like that. They talk about now. You have another one in the Hindu story of Hanuman. So the Monkey King, like Son Goku, whatever else they say that might be based on Hanuman, but essentially what it is, the supreme being and his consort Shakti. So that's Shiva and Shakti. They became Vanaras, which are forest dwellers, which corresponds to they're represented as apes in the story, but then this more correctly refers to the ancestors of the Igbos and the West Africans, the Kwa people, folks like this, Neri Igbo. And so, in other words, so they took the form of a couple of these so that they could copulate, which is have sex and make a baby, but then they didn't want to keep said baby, and they told they told Vayu, the god of breath, and we talked about breath and life force, for him to plant that seed in the womb of a Vanara woman, so Igbo woman, Igbo woman, and you basically get a similar story to what we get a few thousand years later with Jesus. Okay, and so or at least a few hundred years later. And so you get a similar story about this being that has to do with life force, transferring seed from the supreme being to this earthly being. And so we got this similar theme in all three of these tellings, all three of these stories. Okay, so this culture of freedom is associated with Amaji. This is important too because Ama is either mother or it's the name of the supreme being, the primordial being that created all, or at least all were created from in the Dogon mythology and whatnot. And it is said that Amaji can also mean the joy of Ama. So the joy of your mother, joy of Ama is without gender because it's the primordial form, which is similar to the story of let's see, is it Ptah of a tomb? Okay, so with the tomb in the, is it a tomb or is it Ptah? It's a tomb because a tomb is the father of the Ennead in the Egyptian pantheon, and he said that before manifestation, he isn't like gendered. It's like it's something before that, and so when he comes into existence, it basically comes as a male and a female that come together and have children, or whatever else. But you also have the tellings in which he basically from his, you either get it that he either spit out his children Shu and Net, or he masturbated. So he just self-made his children. that's the case in point. He self-made them children, and we'll get into that too because we've talked about Shu before. He's wind. He's a god of breath, a god of this life force. Similarly, but more importantly, he's what is between heaven and earth. So he's the connector. So you get this similar thing between Enki, whose name is said to either be Lord of Earth, or connection between sky and earth, heaven and earth. So you got Enki that falls in that category. You've got the story of Jesus that falls in that category. The connection between the spiritual realm and the earthly realm through his parentage. And then you've got this one as well. So, and then Hanuman, in his story, he's considered a avatar for Shiva, the supreme being, and whatnot. So you keep on having the same thing. Now, if we look over here at the cuneiform for Amma, meaning mother, inside of it, you see that it has that little 8-point star, which is the symbol for God. And in the Nisibiri, so you hear that Iberi again, Ibri. And then again, Nisibiri, the tongue of the Iberi, the tongue the language that could pass through, that which is invoked, God, you call that in. So this is inside. And then in the story, the way the Nuwapians tell it is that that Gabriel like formed a light on his hand and then placed it in the stomach of Mary, and then something similarly was done to the testicles of Joseph, such that attraction would be drawn to each other. And then the two of them, they spoke like when he asked her to marry him, and she replied yes. Like they were being drawn to say these things. Like it just came out of them. Like he didn't even form his mouth to speak, and it just came out of him like this or whatever. So it said that influence was placed on them in the form of possibly chi, because I've seen some pretty interesting things with chi and thought forms in my own Taoist training with regards to healing and things of that nature. And so that does make a lot of sense to me. Like you have a baby the natural way, but there are things you can do to influence the field of a person using chi that might influence their decisions and draw their attraction to them. So that's it's interesting that they would bring that element into it in the way that the Nuwapians tell it. Now, we've associated God with this star over here with we talked about the association with Christ with that, but we've also talked about how what that has to do with Shu as a representation of the vibrations that are woven together within the enclosure of the Calabi Yau space in quantum physics that basically project the what do we call them, the fundamental forces, and allow us to perceive matter. So solid things. So these vibrations weave together and then we perceive them as matter. And so you've got that independent of itself, but then you've got that star inside of this enclosure. So it's basically like a womb. It's the womb of the mother. And then according to the Nuwapians, that the womb is what the chalice, the Holy Grail, represents in those stories or whatever. So that chalice is the womb. It's the black woman's womb. And he said that he brought back the secret of so the Black Madonna that you see in Europe all over the place, that they celebrate and everything else. So this black version of Mary with this child, they're saying that is actually, now there's, I believe they make a distinction between Mary Magdalene and a Marie Magdala, because apparently this Marie Magdala is she was Egyptian, I believe, Egyptian or Ethiopian, one of the two. And then the what you're seeing in that picture, the Black Madonna, is actually um Isis and Horus. So basically bringing this back to Europe, the Knights Templar, they found out the truth about what went down and child of Jesus or whatever. But this child is basically the same, one and the same with this Simon. So once again, we've got this sign pointing back toward this Osho. Okay, and so anyway, so we've got the God inside of an enclosure, and then that's what gives us that pentacle, which we explained is the vibrations inside of the Calibi Yao space, now allowing it to form matter. So all of these initiatory practices and things, these stories, they were basically designed to teach you how we make ourselves, basically how we come as a from a massless waveform, not interacting with this particular space, to becoming a solid figure that does interact with this place. Okay, and so we are equating Shu with Enki, at least in terms of the symbolism there. All right, so there were, before I get into that, let me finish breaking down Alma G. So the other part of that is to send or return, or send as if like a messenger. So that messenger, once again, ties back to that whole angel concept. And then it also has a part of close or lock away. So basically you lock away the Amma. So Amma is a point. And so the other thing I could have drawn here is that circle with a point in the middle that represents the sun, or represents Ra. So that dot in the middle of a circle is basically this same concept. That dot, that circle, we're talking about sonoluminescence, the way that sound becomes light, the way that sound becomes matter. All of that is programmed into all these myths and these stories. That's the central concept in all of these stories. All right, and so so according to the way it's told by the Terra Papers, in conjunction with the bear in mind, in Mesopotamia, you had the Sumerians there, then you had the Akkadians, then you had the Babylonians and stuff. And so in each case, depending on which god was more popular, they had them as kind of like the top of the food chain, the top of the pantheon and things. But as it goes, there were two Enkis. So Enki was pretty much a title when you were the lord of the planet, the lord of the earth, or whatever. And the first Enki was actually King Zeus, who, interestingly enough, corresponds to, they say Zeus in the Greek pantheon, but Zeus is also associated with Amun. So this is why we're talking about Amun here. And so there were two figures that had the title Amun. You had the original, and you had Marduk, the son of Enki, who took that name Amun from the first Enki. So there appears to be some confusion there when they talk about Enki as to whether they're talking about the first Enki or the second Enki. The second Enki is more appropriately associated with Ea, which means water, and so that first Enki is very likely more associated with Zeus. Now, King Zeus is also syncretized with Pazuzu, so he was at odds with his uncle, who was An, the supreme god of the Anunnaki, and the who had a similar primordial kind of creation type of story to what I just described with Atum, but in that case. What was I talking about? So because he had this rivalry with him or whatever was going on, because basically An had usurped his uncle, and so his uncle's son ended up in the same position or whatever, the take over from him. And so it was like basically karma coming back around in that way. Okay, and so Zeus, King Zeus, he was also synchronized with Pazuzu. So you hear about this demon Pazuzu or whatever, but that was mostly because An ain't like him, so they demonized him as well. Now the other aspect of that is that he is synchronized with the Egyptian god Bes, who is basically a dwarf-like, cat-like god associated with fertility. So once again, we get this same concept of Osho associated with this fertility and stuff. And Geb, all right. So and then Geb is one of the children of Shu. So we got this same concept again of this god. So we got the son of God who also has a son, the grandson. We got this same concept between Enki, Marduk, and Marduk's son Nabu, who is often syncretized with Thoth. We've got the same motif with Zeus, his father, and his son. So you got you got three generations. So you got Uranus, who was usurped by his son Saturn, who was usurped by his son Jupiter, and then that corresponds to Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus in the Greek pantheon. So it's basically telling you how you have this point of origination, the original ring or Anu, represented by Uranus, and then you have which it sounds very similar to Oannes, which is a name for a water or fish type deity that is associated with Enki, but we'll get into that in a minute. But below Uranus, of course, you have Kronos / Saturn, who is associated with time, and then he is taken over by his son Zeus, who's associated with joy, lightning, electricity, static electricity, clouds, the things that hold clouds together, static electricity and discharge. We talked about that in excess. Okay, and so Zeus corresponds to a dot. We talked about that in this relationship, the square root of 2 and the throat in previous videos. They are also associated with Baal, who is a storm god. So, and then all of that is associated with Bet El. So Bethel, Bet El, which is corresponds to being housed in. So the enclosure. So we're talking about the enclosure of God. He who remains, he who rests. So the Christian is the one that contains the Christ. It's not supposed to be somebody who's following something. It's somebody who's supposed to be discovering it within. Okay. And so, anyways, moving right along. So we covered. Okay, so we talked about the Alma jig over here, joy of Alma, and we said that Zeus is associated with Alma. So we're basically combining this electricity aspect with the point of origin, this point in space, and then it frees itself. So we're talking about electric discharge for the most part. But that also means that freedom from that Calabial space also means that you're materializing. And so you have been initiated. And so, interestingly enough, the Amajig are concentrated here in Libya. And like I said in a previous video, El Ibia actually means a plagiarism or copy of God, if you will, interestingly enough. And so, or to steal, or the god of theft. That's the other translation of that. And interestingly enough, the god of theft happens to be Hermes. The god of thieves is Hermes. So Hermes, Thoth. Once again, we right back at that same motif. The god that's said to have given man writing and taught them magic or whatever else. Once again, we back to this sorcerer stuff. So the same theme is across all these cultures. Okay, and Tripoli, so that already has a association with 3. So we've got this idea. We got these 3 different Jesuses. We got 3 Marys. We got especially 3 Marys in the story associated with Melusine, the mermaid with 2 tails. That is the logo of Starbucks. And so those 2 tails, it appears to represent the 2 tails of Jesus's origin. And She is considered an ancestor of the Merovingians in France, who are said to have been descended from the Christ blood and all that. So it's tied and all that. But anyway, Libya is called, Tripoli is called the Mermaid of the Mediterranean. That's the nickname of the place. So you keep seeing this theme of the mermaid come up because you got the Numo and over in the Dogon, and then you've got Nama, who is the mother of Ea. So Ea Enki, his mother, he has a different mother from his brother Enlil, and his mother is Nama, who is a primordial being who is said to have been something of a sea serpent. So we've got this cross section between fish and serpent. So this is where we end up with Jesus as the Word, and this association of Jesus with the Pisces or Pisces. Remember when I was telling you about the arrangement of those points associated with Horus, Ra, and Atum in Giza, extending like basically the direction that the Sphinx is facing out to that point at Al Batran in Egypt. That is a Vesica Pisces, because it is the intersection of two circles that are intersecting each other's center point. And we just talked about the center point and the importance of that. So essentially what's happening is we're talking about birefraction. So birefraction is when a light shines through a crystal in a particular way to where it polarizes the light, having a horizontal plane as well as a vertical plane of light. And through the separation of these two things, you're able to manifest certain charges in space. Peace, Keith, I see you. And so this is what we're looking at when that Vesica Pisces split, and that little Pisces in the middle, that little shape that looks like an eye or fish shape or whatever. This has everything to do with this concept of Jesus and this fish and these mermaid motifs and this initiation motif. Okay, and so we got Numo, Namo, got that similar association with Ama, the mother. Okay, and so Amun is considered synonymous with El. So we already talked about El. And then if El is that God that we talked about, so Ankiel and the aspects of God, then it looks like we're pointing back to our original meaning. But then in addition, El is associated with is considered one and the same with Yahweh, who we have distinguished as being associated with Hayahu, derived from he. So Hiwa. So you got Huhi. You got some people that will pronounce it like this, and then you got this idea of Huayu, which is Vayu, the god of breath. So we got this story in the Bible of God giving breath to Adam, giving breath to the earth, the union of breath and earth. Breath is spirit, so spiritus means breath in Latin and comes from Greek as well. And so the union of breath and earth is talk about this same thing that's represented by Enki or Ankiel. Okay, so Vayu. So this is our confirmation that Vayu in the Hanuman story is serving the same purpose as Ibriel or Gabriel in the biblical story of Jesus and Mary. All right. So we get over here. So we got mermaid. So Mediterranean. So we got these mermaid motifs with the Numo story, all this stuff. So we've got Dogon tribe, some of my ancestors. You've got Dagon, who is another name for Oannes, who I talked about before, who is supposed to be a messenger. Remember messenger, the Hermes, of Ea, who is water. And he, so Enki / Ea is often depicted as a mermaid type of dude. He's a merman. He's got the fish tail. He's a Capricorn. So Capricorn is just half goat, half fish, and that's supposed to be Enki as well. That's where we get into this December motif. And then you got the Jesus that was born in December. So you got these three versions, and then the one that was born in December was the one I talked about, Cleopis, who was the descendant of Cleopatra. And so he was the one associated with that December 25th. Let me see. So Simon Bar Jesus was the one that was hold on, which one was crucified? Okay, so Simon was the one that was crucified, and then this one, Cleopis, is the one that's associated with Isha. So the one that is said to have gone to India and got initiations there and visited Tibet and all that stuff that Noble Drew Ali talks about. That's that one. So that's the grandson of basically grandson of Jesus, if you will. Okay, and then you have this ongoing theme. So I talked about Shambhala. So peace on earth is something very much associated with Shambhala, and UNESCO organization, interestingly enough, is all tied into that. And the child of the supreme being in the Hindu pantheon, so the child of Shiva and Shakti is understood to be Kartikeya, aka Skanda, who is considered a god of war, similarly to both Ares, the son of Zeus, and as well as Ogun, who's my head in Orisha. And you think of Ogun, Dagon. So you got their root in there. Okay, and then Mars. They say that their root is associated with Moor, so we'll get into that a little bit more. We talked about the association with the Mora, those serpent-like women who are described in some European lore, and then you got to put out milk for them. They like the milk, and I broke down the symbolism of that. And okay, and so they talk about Vega. So how do we jump to Vega? We talked about the planet Vega with it, these concepts of the Hindu gods, the Devas, where they originate. But then so the Naga, there's a Naga tribe in like not Thailand, but is it Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia somewhere. The Nagas, and then they claim descent from the Nagas. They talk about the serpent people, which is very likely correspond to the Ophi, the Ophi of over near where the Magus was, and this guy was known as the Magus. So Osho Magus is a wizard. So magnetism, Magus, all of that is involved. And then when we talked about how a serpent or a dragon, dragon particularly having to do with the spine, but then a serpent having to do with the way that magnetic fields they spiral. They cause a spiraling motion that's associated with vortexes when applied to water and things of this nature. So we got this whole concept that links us back to Vega and then they talk about a planet Vulcan in the Nuwapian teachings, the Wusabat teachings. But then we also we connected Vega from those stories, those spirituality stories, Star Vega with Vulcan via them making the Vulcan race on Star Trek resemble the way that the Vega people are. Okay, and then this is pretty much who you have in Shambhala, because according to the various legends, the people of Sirius, which is involved in all of this, like even the 8-point stars associated with Sirius and esoteric teachings, the folks from Sirius are said to have been descendants from Vega, particularly A and B, and then you had the Anunnaki that were on Sirius C apparently, and then they were the result of a mixture between, you had reptilian queens and you had these mammalian Syrians or whatever that mixed the bread, and so these become the aquatic apes, quote unquote, that they say live here in our oceans. And then these were the same, quote unquote, mermaids that would have given the Ikpe folks of the Ikoi tribe of West Africa, who they say gave them the Nisibiri language. So all those things end up connected. So they've got their mermaid lore as well, just like everybody else, and it's all connected. But these give us our Naga. So they the Wusabat, they talked about the Panajaru, And so I broke that down into Naga plus beast. So this blending between the serpent side and the man side, and because of that, you'll have like the 13th constellation that was this debated about, Ophiuchus, who is basically the snake tamer. We talked about how that connects to Asclepius. We talked about how that connects to Joseph of the Old Testament, as well as Imhotep and all these guys, and also to Shiva or Isha. So it's like, so we got this common theme running through all of these, of this idea of you having a mammalian side and a reptilian side, and your whole goal is to tame that reptilian side that is tied to your survival functions, that's tied to your sexual reproduction. So all those animal urges are more tied with that part of the brain, and so you're bringing that into a more manageable type of state. Okay, so now let's get over here to this side, because we want to continue breaking down these numbers. Alternatively to this version of Ankh, which means peace, you've got Egyptian Ankh. Oh, they'll say 14 and the 8. And then we've got the vowels. So in a lot of those older languages, the vowels were interchangeable to where your A's, your E, all those. So you'll see An or spelled as E-N or A-N in different cases. And so connecting that phonetically to the Egyptian, Ankh has a list of meanings, and then E, which is represented by J over there, could give you I or my. So when they added like dot J to something, it was based on E. So that'll be give us Enhki. All right, so we got a similar phonetics, and so it's basically saying my life, or I live, I dwell, I am living, I am alive. Beit El, the dweller. So that the etymology of dust has to do with velu, which has to do with dwelling or vapor or smoke. And so this is where we get this concept of God living in the clouds, but we're talking more about life force, bam bam bam, chi or ki, which is associated with the electricity. So we got static electricity, and then once that static electricity finds a path to discharge and continues to flow, that's that electricity going up and down our spine. Okay. That Egyptian Ankh, so when it has that little smiley face looking diacritic under it, it makes that H have a sound like in Kim. Okay. And so it gives us Ankh. It also means oath. One thing you may not know is that Eden is actually a plural word, which is the plural of a word meaning oaths. So oaths. So if we talk about the garden of oaths, garden comes from a word meaning enclosure. So a garden of oaths. So oaths are things, words that bind. So in other words, we've got vibrations that are bound. Garden of Eden, enclosure of bound words. Serpent, membrane. So we're talking about D-brains in quantum mechanics. All right. So each one of those ways that it's enclosed gives us different dimensions or letters, different ways that vibrations manifest as physical matter. So these are the letters of creation. The Garden of Eden is where those enclosures are, and that garden, that enclosure, is that circle. It's that womb. The womb is the garden. So in that story, if you think about it, so you got these stories of us starting out as a fish type being, and then growing into a man, and that initiation. Well, the initiation of your life starts at conception, and then when you're in the womb, you're pretty much submerged in liquid, and you are an amphibian. You're breathing that liquid in the womb, and then you eventually graduate to where your lungs are strong enough to breathe air. So you basically go through millions of years worth of evolution in the course of 9 months. So each time we master a certain section of evolution, we In fact, before you form legs, you even look like a little, like the feet the 2 feet. It almost looks like a tail. Like if you've ever looked at the ultrasounds, so you look like a little mermaid looking thing or a seahorse looking thing before you form legs and stuff. So just imagine that you were once upon a time there was a version of you that just got to that point and then it just grew up like that. Or if you look at each of the stages that you go through, there's even a stage where you look kind of lizardy. There's just like all these, you can see all those stages over the course of a baby developing. Like it looks hella weird to see them before they start actually looking like a person in the womb. Okay, and so if you think about the womb as the garden, where those oaths are, where those binding sounds are happening. That's why they say it's important what sounds that your child hears while they're in the womb, because they're surrounded by water, and the way that those vibrations go through the womb is going directly into the body, and that can stimulate the digestive tract and other parts of the body in ways that are very much tied to being able to epigenetically alter your DNA and stuff. So there is a component of sound associated with how your DNA expresses itself while you're in the womb. So that's very important. Okay, so it can mean prisoner of war. Peace, April. I see you, cuz. Prisoner of war. And then, mind you, we talked about how Kartikeya, Skanda, aka Ogun, Ares, is a god of war. So, a prisoner of war. So, you are in closure of war. War is also associated with the opposite of peace. So, it's considered chaos. So, in other words, we take these chaotic vibrations that are all over the place and we put them in an enclosure so that they can become organized. And then from there, you are birthed into matter. You become a physical form after that soup that was mixed together in your mama's womb comes together and makes a you. And then you come out all cooked and ready. All right. That Ankh, that life force, all of that is also an epithet for the sun. So epithet for Ra, epithet for the sun. The Godhead in the Hindu pantheon, Vishnu, is also associated with the sun. And Vishnu's avatars started out with a mermaid-like avatar, a fish avatar, then became an amphibian that could come on the land, then became like a boar or like a walking animal, then became a upright standing animal or beast, and then you had a strong man, you had a dwarf in there somewhere, and then you started having regular people when you got to Rama the seventh. And Rama was a black dude. Then you had Krishna, who was he was considered a sweet one. He was nice, he was mischievous, but he was sweet. And Krishna, you hear the stories about him and associated with Christ and all of those parallels and whatnot. He was black. And then after that, really it was supposed to be his brother, but they replaced the eighth with Buddha. And then, or was that ninth? So Krishna would be eighth, and then Buddha would be ninth. They mix up the order sometimes, but then after Buddha is the last one, the 10th avatar, which would be it'd be Kalki. And then he is associated with metal armor and riding a horse and all this stuff. And so this is actually a stage of man where he has mastery over his technology and things of that nature. So we basically go from a fish form in the womb to being a master of our machinery and our technology and all of that good stuff. And so you'll see that the avatars of Vishnu actually represent stages of human evolution, not just over millions of years, but within your lifetime. We go through the whole course of human evolution within a lifetime. Okay, and then we graduate and we become souls again. All right, so that same word, that Ankh, also is a epithet of inundation. So the epithet of the flood. So now we've got the great flood in here as well. And then mind you, so we had Matsya, that first avatar of Vishnu, is also associated with a great flood story. So it is not exclusive to the biblical telling of Noah. And it is suggested by the Nuwapians in particular that that at the beginning of the biblical story in Genesis, this is is basically after a previous flood, because it talks about God flying over the faces of the water, moving over the face of the water, And it suggested that this particular Genesis story is just specific to a particular bloodline, but then there had already been, various iterations of people before that, and this is just after one of the resets. So it's the beginning after a particular great flood. So we got multiple great flood stories from different time periods. And so we could also bring this mermaid or waterman type of god motif to Poseidon, who was said to have been associated with the seeding of Atlantis. According to the theosophy telling of the story, the Atlanteans started out in West Africa, and all of Atlantis was known esoterically as Kusha. So we get this idea of Kush, which included Nubia, Ethiopia, and part of southern India. So there's this whole kingdom of Kush, the Kushites, who were descendants of Ham, not the cursed ones of Canaan, but Ham, who we understand through Hebrew because of that noise is Kham, which is where we get Kamel. So if you think of it in terms of the term Kim, meaning black, so if this is all the same word, then this is the black element of El, of God. So this is where we get El Kim. So this God of blackness, this black God. By extension, this is where we get alchemy. So alchemy, if we have God, child, and lion, which is interesting because in the previous video we talked about Alce, which appears in the golden ratio, which meant a male griffin, which had the head of a eagle, but in the body of a lion. And so we associated that with the stories they have of Lyra, the first star system that human souls inhabited before they started incarnating physically on Earth. And they were a lion type race, and then later came a avian type race. So that goes back to this Ankiel aspect. And so it's based, and then the Alci Alki is used as a symbolism for Jesus in Europe. So in other words, they're acknowledging that what we're referring to as the blood of Christ, this lineage of Jesus, are these ones who received this quote unquote gift of the feather, that gene that gives us our kinky hair. So these stories of the woolly hair, whatever else, it's this combination of these two types of soul. Now the interesting thing when we come back over here is that other meanings of that Ankh include mirror, so a reflection of yourself. So we talked about Libya being El Ibia, a reflection of self. We got document, we're talking about plagiarism, so this whole document. Well, this R, so we're gonna, what do I do with that? So key by itself, by the way, it gives us child, Horus motif, star. Before I go any further, let me also note that that same sequence of numbers can give us a sentence Eada I Osho. So alternatively to Enki Osho, so Ankh Ki Osho, we also have Eada I Osho. So Eada means related to asp, so aspen, so serpent. So we talked about what that is. We also talked about asp as it relates to the end of the current Quran cycle in 11,916 AD, which is the time when the North Pole of our planet will be aligned with the star of Vega. So it's been basically giving us hints all along. But then Eada, and then I means to speak or say. So related to the serpent, and we know that's associated with word and membrane, plus Osho. So in other words, we got an Osho, a priest, a priestess, a wizard, a sorcerer, who is able to speak the tongue related to the serpent. So in other words, the ability to speak language vibrations that help to shape or edit the vibrations on the quantum level in that Kalabiyah. So this is what's meant by integration of that spirit and flesh, such that as a soul, as a living soul, you can speak the vibrations that manifest what it is that you want. Because on the other side, you can just think what you want, it just appears. But we're learning how to shape the environment, the alchemical environment of our internal system with our own speech, our own invocation, aka God, that which is invoked. All right, so read is interesting to me because so where did I even get this R? So Nagar. So I was playing around with that R because we had this Nagaru, and I remember that G is interchangeable with a K phonetically, and so Nagaru. So we're dealing with this Ankh. We're doing with and then Ankharu. So we've got a couple of ways that we can do that. So the neck without that I on it, so just the NH means lamentable. And there's a very famous story about Isis's lament after Osiris is killed by his brother Seth, and she basically turns into a kite, which is a bird like a hawk or an eagle, and then she spirals around this post, this basically a yew tree post that has been taken to the palace, and she spirals around it, lamented and calling out and crying out as she's doing this ritual, where she's placing the royal child in this magic fire to give it immortality. So we get this concept of the child, the immortality. You got this mother Isis who is notoriously known to change into a serpent, interestingly enough, and have something to do with serpents. And so you keep on having this ongoing theme of the mother associated with serpent, according to the according to the Terror Papers. You had the Orion queens with the Orion. They were basically humanoids who had they were basically reptilians who had evolved far enough to where they had a mostly humanoid form, except for a ridge um, on their head, like forehead or whatever else. And then this is a feature that appears in a number of black children. So that is basically from that lineage. So we got royal blood from Orion that is both mammalian and reptilian, but then we have evolved to more closely tame that side of ourselves. And that goes for all of you. Ain't nobody single. Ain't nobody special. You all got this shit. So okay. So anyways, but read. So we put those together. So in car and Iris's lament. That whole story with those motifs. And then interesting enough, that's if you could find that story about Isis lamenting and then going to Byblos after Osiris is killed. This story is very, very similar to the story of Lazarus and the three Marys, and that is supposed to be associated with this whole concept of Jesus' children and escaping to France and then later going to Egypt, whatever else. But Lazarus is said to come from El Azaru, and so Asar is Osiris. So El Azaru is the god Osiris, the god of Osiris. So Osiris is associated with Sirius, so the god of Sirius. Okay, so Lazarus, the one who came back to life, the resurrector. So we got this ongoing thing. Osiris is resurrected through his son Horus in a manner that like God is made flesh through his son Jesus. So the same thing keeps on popping up again, which would associate Isis with this particular Mary. And like I told you before, that Black Madonna, the mother holding the child in the picture, is said to have been Mary Magdala, not to be confused with Mary Magdalene, but Mary Magdala and her son Simon Bar Jesus, the son of Jesus. Okay. Once again, I'm just telling you how they got it organized. Okay, so that R It can mean reed, particularly a reed pen, and Moses is said to mean reed. So Nagar, so this lamenting, this idea of lamenting, this reed, this Moses. Moses also means moor in reference to like the swampland, like when you have water that is slowed down by the vegetation that's breaking down inside of it, it gets that dark murky color, and this is where we get this idea of the Moor and Mauritania and all of this. And so apparently many of the children of Cleopatra's daughter Cleopatra Selene, many of them had and I believe there was a Selene, wasn't there a Mary Selene or something, a Selene or something that was associated with Lazarus. I had to look that up, but I believe there was a Selene. That's interesting. But anyways, she had a lot of children that appeared to have been rulers in Mauritania. So that's that Moorish connection right there. Okay, and then getting down here, so the Panagaru is Nakaru. We were talking about this Naga over here. It said that what was translated to Niger, so Negro and Nigeria. Okay. Nagaru. So we break it down, A can mean document, house, or part of something. So this housing in, this is showing us that we are dealing with Bet El again, Bethel. And apparently the not Assyrians, what do they call it's what they used to call the Ethiopians back in the day. But they the Abyssians, that's right, the Abyssians, they had this saying, Asar is Beit El. So they're saying Asar, so Sirius is Beit El, or Osiris is Bethel. So this idea of Baal, this resurrected, is basically giving you this idea of what is put inside the mother. So Osiris inside of a casket is his seed in the womb of Isis to give birth to the child, who is Horus. Horus, we've talked about the association with the words chorus through their H sound, as well as with cherub, which is the source of cherub, which is actually derived from cabbage, which is itself derived from a word meaning head. So it isn't coincidence that we call it a head of cabbage. That is a very, very legit etymological link between head. The Hebrew letter resh, it means basically so head is associated with ra, the letter of the Arabic letter. So the Arabic letter ra is the equivalent of resh in Hebrew, and they basically come together to mean Lord, radiance, head. The Lord is the one that dwells within something. Radiance, we're talking about light shining off of something, and then we've got the head. And so all of this is essentially coming together to talk about what happens in the third ventricle, the third eye, which is the fluid filled sac in the middle of the brain where all this electricity happens, all these different impressions from the pineal and everything else come together and give you the impression of reality. So even when your eyes are closed and you fall asleep and your brain cuts off those senses, you still have experiences in the form of dreams and things of that nature, because now your consciousness is navigating those vibrational impressions without interference from the electrical stimuli coming in through those senses. So your consciousness is always doing that. It's just that you're aware of one thing or the other, depending on whether you're awake or asleep and the chemicals that are present in your body at that time. Okay, so all in all, case in point, get a snapshot of that if you need to. Case in point, this code, which is the fourth of six, so it's the fourth of 6 lines that radiate throughout the first 432 digits of 5 when it is arranged in a meandering, quote unquote, serpent shape, like I've demonstrated before. And for all intents and purposes, this is the line of code that is very much defining much of who and what we are in this particular iteration of humanity. And in the next one, I think I will compare and contrast those first. I'll show you what those 6 lines that are associated with the propagation of light based on squares. And it was also okay. So even more importantly, and the last thing I'll touch on is that you deal with inverse squares typically when you're talking about light, because you're basically talking about a gradient, a rate at which light dims as it moves further from its source. But the other concept that sort of mirrors that in a different way, in a different direction, is diffusion. So it's basically reaction diffusion, something associated with Alan Turing, and we'll talk more about him later as well. But he both has the test for computing, and at which point a computer system becomes indistinguishable from a human being. When you're talking to it, you can't tell the difference. So that was a big thing. And then he also studied reaction diffusion, which has to do with like a chemical being released and then spreading out in a certain pattern and certain timing. And this is associated with the spots on a leopard, why that skin is like that, as well as the distribution of melanin on the skin of dark-skinned people, because our whole body isn't just randomly covered in melanin. We have white palms and white feet, and more specifically, on our palms, we have specific lines that are darkened. So this is the same process by which leopards get their spot. And then if you looked at the previous videos, that term leopard comes up a lot because we talk about the Ekpe Society, who are also known as the Leopard Society, who use the secret Nisibiti tongue that we were just talking about. And that may very well be the influence behind the creation of the Black Panther comic book and Wakanda and all of it. So they gave us this technology in order to learn and use and be able to, gain our sovereignty back and stuff. And that leopard, I talked about Isha, meaning in West Africa, always active. Well, the Ishango bone, I may have talked about it in the video already. If not, I have to get to it. But the Ishango bone is considered like one of the oldest examples of humans being able to use math and counting and things of that nature. And I discussed the hidden message that is found in. I may not have. Yeah, matter of fact, that's gonna be a whole nother video, because I found out once I learned a little bit more Ethiopian language, I found some amazing things, and it basically mirrored this narrative that's coming out right here. So this idea of these serpent women and the fish and blah, and what their esoteric meaning means, and the association of all that with the Bible. So basically, this is one story, and in different cultures, based on their context, they're making their own versions of the story and stuff. But that whole leopard, so Ishango bone basically means always active leopard. And so it appears to actually be referring to the calculation, the basic quantum computing that's happening in our body, and our melanation being a reflection of their process. And so given its association with particularly magnetic fields due to the paramagnetic effects experienced by melanin, it does appear to be a mechanism by which our bodies function as a hybrid quantum computer that utilizes both chemical computing as well as electrical computing, using the electrical signals of the nerves and central nervous system and stuff like this. And the first computers that the Nazi scientists helped America to build were very much based on those same principles. So the mixing between chemical factors and electrical factors in very large computers back in the day enabled them IBM in 1961 to release a voice recognition talking computer that was the basis of the HAL 9000 AI in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. So you see how all of this is coming together, and I'm pretty sure our leopard brothers from West Africa, the panther brothers, in fact, I believe, if I recall correctly, I would have to look it up. It's in my notes somewhere. But Cleopatra actually is related to the word panther. So panther is related to the patra that's in there. So it's the great the not the grace of the greatness of panther. So the great so Cleopatra's name has something to do, and that Cleopis, the Isha Jesus, it's got something to do with panthers, and I'm gonna look at it, and it has to have something to do with this computing that I'm talking about. But I'll bring it all together in the next one for you. But just keep that in mind. The Patra in Cleopatra is both father and related to panther. So that is pretty dope, all things considered. And then once we break a little bit more down, we just want to get that code. I give you the other parts of the code so you can see how there's a full story there that basically encompasses a lot, if not all, that I just said in this breakdown. But this is wild. Like the fact that it's just in these numbers and it's just encoded. Oh, I did miss that. Okay, so in this Nakaru, so RW also means lion, and apparently the etymology of the word lion doesn't just apply to the big cat, but particularly a wild beast, which includes both a dog and a lion. Okay, and so this is where we're talking about this Nagaru, this Naga beast, how this Enhki or whatever, this lion child, this wild child, this beast child, the god of the beast child, whatever, as a motif associated with Jesus. So it's a code that was implanted in the whole mathematics and physics of the universe, such that it can physically manifest in the form of a human. And the bloodline did not stop with this person. The soul lineage did not stop with this person after that manifestation of their soul. Even in the Ethiopian, there's a book I'm reading right now, Mela Wujet, where it's talking about this internal alchemy and what it has to do. So there's nothing that you can touch or you can study or you can look at or religion you can follow that it hasn't been touched in some way by alchemy, because it isn't about like just magic or something like this. It's about the actual interaction between you and the physical reality through chemical and electrical responses. And so if you do science, you're doing alchemy. If you're a Christian, you're doing alchemy. If you're Muslim, you're doing alchemy. It's just you're not sitting there trying to make gold. You're not sitting there trying to make material stuff. You are only trying to shape the internal environment of yourself such that you are civilized and stable and not succumbing to your beast nature. Okay? And on that note, I'll flip this camera. I'm going to say peace, and I'll see you in part 8.